Well, welcome to GovExperts Insights, where we talk about politics, policy, and the practice of both. Today, we're going to be talking about lobbying ethics in the state of Texas. And we have with us a very special guest, Ross Fischer, who is a former chair of the Texas Ethics Commission. He's also a former prosecutor and a professor and many other illustrious titles. He is most recently a top attorney focused on professional ethics and providing advice to candidates, office holders, boardrooms around the state. Ross, welcome to the episode, and we appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
Great. Ross, you and I have known each other for quite a while. I think it was at a copy room in the Capitol in 1995 sometime. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you have come from a point of being a legislative staffer to your current practice in law, and a little bit about your personal journey.
Sure. You and I met when I was working in the legislature, and I worked in the legislature while I was an undergraduate, and then while I was in law school. And then where I worked one session after finishing law school, and I realized that I didn't have the proper temperament to go out and be a lobbyist like you and be nice to all those people. And I knew that I'd get bored being at a state agency. So thankfully, I got a call from one of our hometown activists back in my home of Kendall County and said that the office of county attorney was vacant and they were looking for somebody to appoint. So I moved back home to Kendall County. I was a prosecutor for 4 years. I was a county attorney, prosecuted my friends from high school, some of their parents, some of their kids. I got to see a whole different side of my hometown. And then after that, I was appointed in 2005 to the Texas Ethics Commission by Governor Rick Perry. And that agency oversees campaign finance laws in Texas, the Texas lobby law, personal financial disclosures, those sorts of things. So I served on there for 5 years, including 1 year as chairman of the Ethics Commission. And then all that while I did some local government work for cities and counties as a lawyer, worked at a couple of small law firms. And since 2019, have been out on my own with my own solo law practice. And really since leaving the commission in 2010, I've been doing this sort of work right in front of the commission, representing lobbyists, candidates, office holders, political action committees, corporations that want to get involved in the political process.
And mainly you've been focused on either defending them if they've got an issue that they're trying to deal with, or advising them on how to comply with what is a pretty complex set of regulations that's somewhat continuing to evolve over the last 10 years, especially in some of the challenges. That is kind of what do you see as I guess maybe we step back a little bit and talk about what do we mean when we talk about ethics and lobbying.
So when I talk about ethics, I think of it in legal compliance in sort of the public arena, in public advocacy, whether that's at the ballot box as a campaign, or whether it's at the Capitol as a lobbying activity. So I consider ethics, because it's all regulated by the Texas Ethics Commission, I consider that to be advocacy at the ballot box, advocacy at the Capitol, and making sure that you're complying. And something that you hit on is that in most areas of the law, things move slowly, right? There's not a lot of quick change in the legal world. But in the last 10 years in campaign finance, it has been evolving very quickly, starting with Citizens United decision from the U.S. Supreme Court in 2010. And in the dozen years since then, it's been a pretty, as legal things go, things change pretty quickly. And that's, it's interesting. It's good for me as a lawyer and practitioner, but also this does go to our fundamental rights, right? Like our speech, our ability to be involved in elections, our ability to petition lawmakers. So it is a quickly changing area of the law, but also an area of the law that is essential to our First Amendment rights.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, do you, as you focus in on that First Amendment and the clause after the freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and all those things, when you get down to petition your government, that's really what we're talking about here. And obviously, as the government has grown in complexity, there's been a need for and more professional lobby engagement to assist individuals and companies to how to engage on that. I mean, speak to a little bit about kind of what you see in terms of the challenges there, and maybe some of the, if you're a corporation or a citizen and want to make sure that you're complying with the law, what are some steps that you need to take right up front?
Well, I mean, let's talk about the fact that I know lobbyists are busy during the legislative session, but things happen a lot in Texas during the interim, right? Especially state agencies get to work implementing laws. They're busy during the interim. Legislative committees meet during the interim to do studies. And so if you're a person who has interests that are going to be impacted by a state agency or by the legislature, that happens year round now. So it's not like you can just take the interim off, right? You need to be engaged throughout the year, every year. In Texas, the way that we approach that, right, is that, I mean, lobbying is a profession. And so like you talked about, it's a lot for just a normal person to know. I mean, there's different areas, I think, and different kind of lobbyists, frankly, right? There's your subject matter experts that really know a subject matter, and you'll want that person on your team. There's what I would call relationship experts, right? There's people that have relationships with policymakers. And so your lobby team might want to take that into account too. So there's those, you need people that know what they're talking about, but you also need people who know the process and know the players. So that's all, I think, part of putting together a reliable government relations team or lobby team. The other thing to keep in mind is that in Texas, there's not a lot of limitations on what a lobbyist can do. It's all about disclosure, right? And so the lobby law is intended to highlight who's being paid to go talk to the legislature, or who's paying who to go influence decision making at a state agency. So it's really about illuminating those relationships and shining a light on that so that the public knows, okay, this company, this business is paying this person to go talk to these folks about this issue. And the idea behind the lobby law is to shine a light on that so that people know that, right? And the way that it's structured is, if all I do is go down and testify at a hearing, then I'm not lobbying, because that's public, right? Or if all I do is write an op-ed piece to put in the newspaper, that's out there for the world to see. It's when I start meeting with policymakers, taking them to dinner, taking them.
When you're paid to communicate on behalf of a client on a particular issue. Right?
Either when you're paid to communicate on behalf of a client, or you're spending money, you're paying to take somebody to dinner, you're paying to advocate. Those are the things that the lobby law is intended to identify and disclose.
And Texas's lobby law really has come about since the mid-70s, kind of as an aftermath of Sharpstown and that scandal. Things, and I know that we still got laws on the books from that kind of are challenging to follow up in today's times. But speak a little bit about how the evolution of that has happened over the last several years.
Well, I mean, I think you're right. I think that back when they started regulating the practice of lobbying, it was basically trade associations would have an executive director who lobbied the legislature. And it was really in the late 70s that, in early 80s, that this, what I would call the hired gun or the outsourced lobbyist became a real career, right? Is to say, this person has relationships, they have a knowledge of the process, they have subject matter expertise, and they're representing multiple clients, right? So other people from different industries are hiring this contract lobbyist to go represent their interests. And I think that, that's been around, since probably the early 80s, but in the grand scheme of things, it has morphed from sort of a trade association model to what people would call, rightly or wrongly, a hired gun model. And there's still, the lobby world includes all those people. It includes people that are subject matter experts. It includes executive directors of trade associations, and it includes your contract lobbyists that have a lobby firm and represent multiple different types of entities or business interests before the legislature.
And so all those, and I want to talk a little bit of things here, the difference between state level lobbying and federal, as well as, kind of what you're seeing at the local level. But for those entities that you just described, the hired gun, the trade association, the in-house, they all have the same level of requirements. They've got a registration requirement generally. I guess it could be, either annual or monthly in terms of the reporting requirements. And you're doing the disclosure there of the activities that have happened that you paid for in the prior month. And you've also got a disclosure on which clients you're representing. Right. So as you're like looking out there in terms of the issues where most people could get in trouble, where do you see kind of the biggest areas?
Well, I would speculate that there's a lot of people that are lobbying that aren't registered as a lobbyist. And that's an issue, right? Because there's criminal consequences to that. And the way the law is written, if you're required to register, you have to follow these rules, even if you're not registered. So if you're out there skirting the law by lobbying without registering at the Texas Ethics Commission, you're still subject to all these different restrictions. So it's in everyone's interest to go ahead and register. That's, you're erring on the side of disclosure. The other thing that I think you should be mindful of is that lobbyists can do stuff that non-lobbyists can't, meaning that because they disclose their activity, they can take legislators to dinner. They can take legislators.
Gives you a defense on those things, right?
It gives you a defense, and the penal code recognizes that, like, because lobbyists disclose their activity, they get a defense in certain situations. Where I'm not a lobbyist, right? But if I were to go spend money on a legislator, it might not be legal, because generally legislators can't take anything from anyone subject to their jurisdiction. And as a resident of Texas, I'm subject to their jurisdiction. But you, as a registered lobbyist, may be able to go to the exact same thing, report it on your lobby report, and it's okay because the public's made aware of it and the law recognizes that, okay, he's following the law, he's reporting that, it's not a secret. So, and that helps the client too, right? If they're hiring someone that is a professional that can go do what they can't do normally, then that helps the client as well.
So does that apply in like the instances where you've got somebody that's selling services or other things into government or everything? I mean, speak a little bit to the complexity, because I know that's been it's been a topic in the legislature over the last several years, and I think a lot of businesses, which are interested in trying to provide services to the state, may not be aware of some of the nuances in the registration requirements there.
Well, if you're trying to influence if you're getting paid or you're spending money to influence a legislative decision or to influence an executive branch decision,
like a procurement decision,
any executive branch action. So it could be getting the contract to sell paper clips to the comptroller's office. If you're getting paid to go influence that decision by communicating with somebody at the comptroller's office, then you're subject to the lobby law, right? So it's if you're getting paid to do that, to try to influence their decision through direct communication.
Yeah. And so the real trigger here is whether or not you're getting paid. I mean, that's the first threshold. Are you getting paid to make some communication? You're not talking about, I mean, there's not a situation where the average citizen who just has a complaint about something that's going on with the state that they want to take to their state representative or to a committee, they're not subject to the Texas lobby law, are they?
No, because they're not getting paid for their advocacy is basically volunteer advocacy, right? They're doing it because it's important to them. They're not getting paid to do it. So they're not subject to the lobby law. It's only if you get paid to do it, or if you're spending money on somebody, like you're taking a decision maker to lunch, then you have to worry about whether or not the lobby law applies to you.
Yeah. And, in terms of how things manifest, I understand Texas is somewhat complaint driven. The Ethics Commission does a review and an investigation, and then you'll have like a forum there. And then I assume that then it gets into the court systems after there if you're not able to resolve it at that level.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, the Ethics Commission can handle sworn complaints. So if someone could file a complaint to say, I swear I saw Ross down at the Capitol every day last month, and I think he's getting paid a lot to lobby, and he hasn't registered as a lobbyist. And the Ethics Commission would take that complaint, vet it, and then investigate it and decide whether or not to move forward with what's basically like a trial at the Ethics Commission.
And the Ethics Commission itself is basically a somewhat independent agency outlined in our Constitution, made up of appointments from, the governor, the House and the Senate, but also bipartisan and everything to try to oversee this entire system. Is that somewhat an unusual construct relative to other states, or is that how does our Ethics Commission line up to what you've seen elsewhere?
Well, as you pointed out, it's constitutional, which makes it interesting. So, it's there, right? It's not going to go anywhere unless the voters repeal it. But yeah, I think that superficially, if you just read it, there's 8 members. So that's already, very rarely you see a board with an even number of people.
You can have
right?
a 4-4 tie, is what you're saying.
You can have 4-4 tie, right? And then you have 4 people from each political party. And like you said, they're appointed there's 2 by the lieutenant governor, 2 by the speaker, and 4 by the governor. And there's supposed to be 4 from each political party. So you think, well, there's 8 people. That's already, designed for gridlock. And then you've got 4 from each political party. Well, they're never going to agree on anything, right? Which is really the way the Federal Election Commission works, is that it's designed for gridlock. I'll say in Texas, despite that design, it very rarely works that way. I mean, everybody, you don't see 4-4 ties. You don't see that kind of stuff. You see people working together to try to, do the agency's job. So it's not, even though it may be designed for gridlock, it doesn't work that way in the real world.
Well, that's interesting. And so that's in the state level things. And you alluded to some of the entities at the federal level, the Federal Election Commission. I know that each house of Congress, the Senate and the House, but each have their own kind of lobby registration there, as well as I think the executive branch. But there's a difference between the federal level, state, and then what's the local. Kind of talk a little bit about the differences there of what at the federal level, and then Texas state level, and then local levels, which I know vary by community and by entity.
Well, I mean, so you talked about at the federal level, each chamber of Congress sets their own rules. Generally, they're narrower than Texas state law. Like, it's if you're lobbying on an introduced piece of legislation, like HR 14, it's been filed. In Texas, it's much broader. It's like anything that can come before the legislature is considered a legislative matter. So much broader, much easier to act in a way that requires you to be a registered lobbyist in Texas. So let's talk about the state lobby law, right? It applies to the legislative branch. It applies to the executive branch. It does not apply to the judicial branch. It doesn't apply to any locality. So then, you ask about whether or not how local government treats lobbying, like lobbying City Hall. Big cities in Texas, most big cities, but not Fort Worth, but like Dallas, Austin, Houston, El Paso, San Antonio have adopted lobby ordinances. So they each have their own unique lobby ordinance, and it might have they all have different requirements. They all sort of follow the same template, that they've taken the outline that the state uses in the government code, and then they've modified it. They've tweaked it. So what may be permissible if you're lobbying San Antonio City Hall may not be exactly permissible if you're lobbying the City Hall in Houston. So it's those big cities that have ventured into regulating lobby activity at City Hall. Most smaller cities, like, it's really confined to the big metropolitan cities. Counties, I was a county attorney, so I know from firsthand experience how little authority counties have in Texas. Counties can't, like, cities basically can do whatever they want until the legislature tells them they can't do that anymore. Counties can't do anything until the legislature tells them you can do that. So counties can't really, they don't have the authority to just go out and adopt an ethics ordinance or ethics order or any kind of ethics system unless they have specific legislative authorization. El Paso County does, Montgomery County does. I believe that Fort Bend County has that. There may have been one more added last session. Some are more robust than others. Dallas County doesn't have legislation, but they, in their procurement process, it's interesting. They have a procurement policy, which they can do. And they put in there, like, you have to register with us if you're trying to influence this procurement. So they've sort of backdoored a lobby ordinance into their procurement policy in Dallas County. But yeah, it just varies from locality to locality.
And so if you're a business that's out there, I mean, you need to be mindful of all of these potential things, because I know in some instances, not following regulations can lead to avoidable procurement, potentially even cause payment issues after you've already performed the services. I know that our legislature has been dealing with a follow-up on HB 1295 from a few sessions ago, and things that basically had some conflict of interest, I think, disclosure required on it. And have you seen that bubble up out there in your conversations with folks?
Well, I mean, I have clients who maybe they want to expand their business they want to do more business with local government. So this is a conversation we have to have, right, as well. Which local government? Is it a big city? And how does it differ? Or, people may have, or companies may have, like, a regional salesperson, and they say, oh, well, I'm in the Dallas region and I'm going to go to City Hall and do this. Well, time out. If you're going to go to Dallas and your job is to sell stuff to the city of Dallas, we need to talk about whether or not you need to register with the Dallas City Secretary as a lobbyist. So, you see that a lot as people try to do more business with localities, or people that are like, that's their job, is business development in a certain region, to think, okay, well, if you're San Antonio, or, your San Antonio City Hall, you might have to register. It's different than what you have to do at Bernie City Hall, even though they're right down the road from each other, right?
Is it fair to say that this may not be top of mind for a lot of folks that are trying to sell into government things, but it's one of those things, if you don't pay attention to it, it could really come back to bite you, both with the validity of an award, potentially money on the line, as well as you wind up having potential public relations issues associated with it.
Yeah, so there's 3 areas of exposure, right? There's, if you violate an ordinance in Texas, it's enforceable. It's like speeding, right? I mean, it's a $500 fine in a prosecuting municipal court. It's a criminal offense, a Class C misdemeanor. So that's not good for the person who failed to register. As you alluded to, there's PR consequences for the business if they're thumbing their nose at the city regulations. And then a lot of the way these are written are that you could jeopardize your procurement, right? So that's like the real monetary risk is that you land a contract and then get it revoked, or that you get disqualified from even getting a contract because you're not following the local ordinances.
Yeah. And so, kind of jumping back at the state level and thinking, I know that for example, the Ethics Commission is coming under sunset review during this next cycle, and that's on top of, you've got both the campaign finance aspect of that, which we're not covering much today, but we've also got lobbying and ethics, requirements that are going to be kind of considered in that. What do you see as kind of the emerging issues on state-based lobbying, and what's your expectations kind of relative to the Ethics Commission sunset?
Well, I think that lawmakers generally and historically, when seeking to look ethical, tend to pick on the lobbyists because they're an easier target, right? They don't say, rather than like hold themselves to maybe a higher standard, they're happy to hold other people to a higher standard. And so I think that a lot of times, what people like to tout as ethics reform is really lobby reform. So I think lobbyists are always should be mindful of that. When people start talking about ethics reform, they might be coming after you. A recurring issue at the legislature is use of taxpayer funds for lobbying, because you've had cities and counties hire lobbyists to go represent their interests at the legislature. That is an ongoing sore spot for some members of the legislature. They don't think that public funds should be used, whether it's school district funds, city funds, county funds, to hire lobbyists. So that's an ongoing issue. Revolving door issues are always out there, whether it's lawmakers leaving and then turning around to lobby their former colleagues, or whether it's agency folks leaving and turning around who they can go work for. Can you go work for someone if you just worked on their contract while you were a state employee? So, I mean, Texas has at least three revolving door statutes that apply to former public employees and officers, and a fourth one that applies to certain legislators in certain circumstances. And so, I help people routinely when they leave the state's employment and they want to go either in the private sector or start a consulting firm. We talk about, okay, there are these different revolving door statutes out there. Which ones apply to you, and what does it mean to your business plan? Because there's criminal penalties associated with some of those restrictions.
Sure, that's very insightful. Well, thank you very much for kind of reviewing that, as well as our general discussion on lobbying. I think we got the second part here, a little bit more fun topic, but I know that you've been focused on kind of telling some stories through screenplays and others over the last several years about Texas. The thing I've loved about them too is they're unknown or overlooked stories from Texas communities. They generally have some political and policy background associated with it. But you and I were involved in many discussions up there that was designating a state capital for the Rose capital of Texas, the Crepe Myrtle capital of Texas. One of the more interesting things that I got involved in was a group of fourth graders in Iredale, Texas, decided that the monarch butterfly should be the official bug of the state of Texas, and that's how we moved the bug bill in the late 90s. But those things play out on a local level, and you had one that was a particularly interesting story, in regards to Seguin, and I think the title of it was Red, White, and Juan. But a little bit of the story about how the Seguin kind of reclaimed a bit of its history, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. This goes back to when I was a really mediocre law student. I wasn't very good. And I had my torts professor, who I did terribly in his class. He believed that lawyers should be trained storytellers. And so he started having students over to his house, which was near the campus. And he just put an ice chest on the front porch, and we'd sit around and tell stories. And I thought, well, if I could get a grade for this, I'd be in good shape. But I did. It was a helpful practice, because then I went to be a prosecutor, and that's just like telling stories to a jury, right? So I've always, had that interest. My dad's a retired Texas history teacher, so I grew up with that interest too. But yeah, so when I was doing local government work, I was the city attorney in Seguin, and because I'm interested in Texas history, I went down and saw Juan Seguin's grave, which is right there by the City Coliseum in Seguin. And I was talking to the planning director. This guy had an office next to me, and I told him what I'd done, with my lunch hour, going to see Juan Seguin's. And he was very skeptical. He's like, that's not Juan Seguin. And then he told me this story about how in the mid 70s, in preparation for the bicentennial, the mayor of Seguin, they located Juan Seguin. Juan Seguin was apparently buried in Mexico because he'd been chased out of Texas after serving in Congress, in the Texas Congress, when Texas was a republic. They chased him out, and he was buried in Mexico. And so he embarked on this crazy scheme and journey to bring Juan Seguin's body back to Seguin, Texas, in time for the 4th of July celebration in 1976, and have a big homecoming. And I just thought that was the nuttiest thing I'd ever heard. And so I went to the city secretary to check out the truthfulness of this. And she said, oh yeah, I've got a whole file on getting the body back in the 70s. And so she made me a copy. And I thought, well, let's make a great movie. And I just carried a copy of this file around for 10 years. And people, you're talking to people about what would make a good movie. And I'd always tell them this, and they'd always say, yeah, that's a good movie. So after about 10 years of carrying the file around, I turned it into a screenplay about bringing Juan Seguin's body back to Texas.
And they were trying to compensate for the fact that they had lost like their title to the biggest,
the world's biggest pecan.
The world's biggest pecan. So some other city claimed that title. They couldn't find a pecan bigger, and so they're trying to.
Their local pride was wounded, and so they had to. You're an elected mayor. You can't let that happen. Somebody steals your title of your town's claim to fame. You got to up your game. So you take the station wagon and you go to Mexico and you put that Juan Seguin in the back and bring him back.
Yeah, if you're okay with it, we'll add a link to the screenplay here as in the comment section when we post online. And,
Sure.
And I know that your second one, I'm trying to remember the order and things in regards to it, but you also focused in on some of those no-man islands down in the Rio Grande, and a little bit about the history of, I think, is it Los Indios Island, which is different than the one that just bubbled up in the press the last few weeks and everything, which is Fronten Island and things. But my understanding is that with the river and the storms and other things, you can have islands that appear and disappear and things. You tell a really interesting story from the 70s in regards to the Los Indios Island and some interesting plans that a Texan had for how that should have been administered and everything. So speak a little bit to that.
Sure. Yeah. So when I was finishing this Juan Seguin screenplay, I mean, and it's silly. Hopefully it's funny, but it really does have some timely themes about borders and nationality, nationality and national pride, patriotism, and really an immigration, right? Because the river's moved. It's moved a lot over the years, over the history of Texas. It's not, our borders are constantly moving. So when I was, I wouldn't call it like in-depth studying, but when I was doing some research, a little light research for the Juan Seguin thing, I stumbled upon these articles from the late 70s and early 80s where an island had been created by a hurricane in the late 1960s at the tip of Texas. Hurricane just hit the very tip of Texas near Brownsville and reconfigured the mouth of the Rio Grande where it empties into the Gulf, and it just changed things, and it created this island that was technically closer to Mexico than to it had been a peninsula that was connected to Texas, and then it became an island. It got severed, and it ended up being closer to Mexico because of the way that the river was reshaped by the storm. And so Mexico took it over, and apparently this guy tried to start his own independent nation on it. He claimed that it was a no man's land that was created by an act of God, and he had big plans for it. He was going to let Cherokees who'd been driven out on the Trail of Tears come repopulate it. He was also going to build some high rises for deposed dictators. It was going to be a tax haven. And the only law was going to be the golden rule, because that was good enough. And so it was just completely, off the wall. So I thought, well, that's a good story. So I wrote a TV pilot about that.
And not to be a spoiler, but did anybody ever actually move to the island and live there, that to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
But it's all kind of a dream in regards to it.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of talk.
Yeah.
But that's what Texans are known for.
Well, exactly. I think so. I think both of those are such interesting stories and things. And I love the fact that they're based on, I think, how do you use the term truish?
Truish.
Truish.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Most of it's made up.
Yeah. Well, Ross, thank you so much for spending some time chatting with us and taking time out of your day. We'll post this. I'll add links to the screenplays along with your information to get back in touch with you. And if folks have other questions about ethics and lobbying in Texas, I'm sure you're welcome to have a conversation after this. And we appreciate you joining GovExperts Insight. I think it's been a good conversation on, like I said, policy, politics, and the practice of both. So Yeah, for those folks that are, you can follow us online in LinkedIn, Facebook, Spotify, and a variety of of platforms for education. We hope you tune in and we hope you enjoy. So thank you all very much.
Thanks for joining this edition of GovExperts Insights. We invite you to follow this and other episodes at govexperts.com or on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and our other social media channels.